The method of drafting and cutting a princess at Bustier that I'll be showing you in this video is perfect if you want a well-fitted and structured bustier. Whether you are a beginner trying to learn pattern drafting or you're already an advanced at it just trying to perfect it, the method I'll be teaching you in this video is perfect for you. Hello, my name is Oluwatosin and welcome to my channel. Let's get right into it. So I'll start this tutorial by drafting my pattern, and here I'm drawing out my starting line. This starting line is the shoulder line. So after marking out my starting line, I'm going to be measuring shoulder to the person's nipple plus half-inch allowance. So this person's shoulder to nipple is 12 and a half, but I'll be adding half-inch allowance, so I'm marking 13. Then I'll be marking shoulder to under the bust plus half-inch and shoulder to the half length plus half-inch allowance. So these 3 points, I'm going to connect each of them into straight lines just like this. The next is I'm going to label them so that I can easily identify them. So shoulder to nipple line, shoulder to under the bust, and then shoulder to half length, which is also the waistline. After labeling this, what I will do next is to divide a nipple to nipple by 2, and I'll be adding 1 inch allowance to this. So whatever the person's nipple to nipple is, divide it by 2 and add 1 inch allowance. Then you mark this in 2 to 3 places and connect it into a straight line starting from the shoulder line to the waistline. Now going back to the shoulder line, you are going to be dividing the shoulder by 2. So divide the person's shoulder by 2, mark that, and then you are going to be adding, at this point I'm adding all my allowance to my pattern paper. So I'm adding 1.5 inch allowance first. Then the next is to mark out the armhole. To mark out the armhole, I used armhole of 8. This person's armhole is actually 19. 19 divided by 2 is supposed to be 9.5. But at this point, instead of marking 9.5, I'll be marking 8. So I used 8 and then I proceeded to drawing the armhole curve. Firstly, I drew out a straight line. Then you're going to be slanting the shoulder. For the shoulder slope, I used 1 inch downward starting from the starting line. Then you are going to divide your armhole. This 8 that you've measured, you will divide it by 2, which is 4. You measure that 4 on the armhole line, and on that point of 4, you go inward with half-inch and proceed to drawing your armhole curve just like I did. Now what is next is on the shoulder to under bust line, depending on how pronounced you want your cup to be. This is where the logic is. So depending on how pronounced you want your cup to be, and this is a function of how busty the person is. Some people have bigger bust than side, and some people have bigger side than bust. So this person's bust is actually 43, but she has more of side than the bust itself. So I'm marking 2 inches. If you are cutting for a busty person, you should use 2.5 or 3. So you are going to be connecting that point to the waistline, and then to the front you'll be marking half-inch allowance, and you connect this half-inch from the under bust to the waistline. It's now time to draw the curve. Firstly, you are going to be measuring where you start drawing the curve line from on the armhole. You measure 4 inches downward on the armhole, and then with the help of your curved ruler, you are going to draw your cup just like I'm doing. Just connect all these points together, the 4 inches on the armhole to the nipple to nipple line, and then down to the 2 inches that you've marked. And on this other side, you are going to be connecting the half-inch to the nipple to nipple line like this. Now towards this armhole, you measure 1 inch to the front and 1 inch to the back, and then you connect these 2 points back into the cup that you've drawn earlier. This is just the logic. Now what is next is to mark out the neckline. For this neckline, I'm using neck width of 7 and neck depth of 3 at this point, and it's a round neck. So you draw out your round neckline, and what is next after this is to shade this area. This area that I'm shading is the part that I'm going to be cutting out. Now for this shoulder line, initially, I added 1.5 inch, but at the point of sewing, I'm still going to be using just half-inch allowance. So marking that half-inch now, this is the part that the armhole will eventually take. It's not going to take that 1.5 inch. That 1.5 inch was just so that I can be able to extend the cup properly. Now I'll go back to the shoulder line, and from there, the slanted shoulder line. From there, I'll be marking the bust point, which in this case I used 9. You are going to connect that point to a straight line, and then you label it as the bust point. So transferring your body measurement into your pattern, on this bust point, you'll be dividing the bust by 4, and you mark that 1 inch allowance that you'll be cutting out at that middle. You'll be adding it. And you remember I said I'm going to be adding all my sewing allowance to my pattern. You might not necessarily add your sewing allowance to your pattern. You can transfer your pattern paper to your fabric first and then add the sewing allowance. But I will be adding my sewing allowance at this point. So on the waistline, I'll be dividing the waist by 4. I'll mark that. And you remember that 2.5 inch allowance that I'll be cutting out at the middle. I'm going to add it at this point as well. So after dividing the waist by 4, I'll measure the 2.5 inch allowance, and then I'll be adding sewing allowance of 1.5 inch. Then I'll connect the bust point to the waistline. Now to mark the yoke and the keyhole neckline of this half length, from the shoulder line I'll mark 6 inches downward, and then from the slanted shoulder slope on the armhole I'm going to mark 5. I'll connect the point of 8 to 5, and for the keyhole neckline, depending on how wide you want the keyhole to be, in my case I just measured 2 inches downward, and then I proceeded to drawing this keyhole neckline, the shape that I want. I can now proceed to cutting out. After cutting it out, I'm going to be transferring my pattern to my fabric. I just labeled the yoke, and this is what the pattern is looking like at this point. For the back panel, the back is way easier than the front. I just measured the half length, and then I added half-inch allowance. I measured the shoulder to under the bust, and I added half-inch allowance. These two lines, connect them into straight lines. Then the next thing is to mark out your shoulder. I'm not going to be using that starting line at this back. If you want, you can, but the edge of my paper is my starting line. So before I mark my shoulder, considering that this dress is going to have zip at the back, I measured zip allowance of 1.5 inch first. I deducted it out before marking the shoulder. So if yours is not going to have zip, you can just ignore the zip allowance part. But because mine will have zip, I had to measure zip allowance of 1.5 inch. After marking the zip allowance, next is to divide the shoulder by 2, and then I'm adding the 1.5 inch allowance that I added for the front. Then you measure 1 inch downward and slant the shoulder slope. Then you are going to use mark the armhole. Remember I'm using armhole of 8, just like as the front. So on that 8, divide by 2, mark 4, and then proceed to drawing out your armhole curve. What is next is to mark out the yoke. So for the yoke, it's going to be a bit lower than the front. For the front, I used 8, but for this back, I'll be using 10. And on the armhole, I'm going to be using 5, just like I did for the front. Then I'll connect this point of 10 to 5. I labeled it as the yoke. For the neckline, neck width of 7, unfold of 2, 3.5, and neck depth of 1.5 at the back. It's now time to mark out the dart. So for the back dart, I'm still going to be dividing the nipple to nipple by 2, and then I'll be adding half-inch allowance. I'll mark that. Then on the armhole, I'm going to use that 5 inches that I've measured, just like I did for the front. So from the point of 5 inches, I'm going to be connecting it to that nipple to nipple divided by 2 that I've measured. Now I'll divide our bust by 4. I'll be adding sewing allowance. Like I said, you can choose to add your sewing allowance when you're transferring your pattern paper to your fabric. Then our waistline divided by 4 plus the 2 inches allowance that I'll be marking out as the dart on the waistline, because I'll be marking out 1 inch to the front and 1 inch for to the back for the dart. I'll add that too as well before marking my sewing allowance. So coming back to the dart, I just measured 1 inch to the front, 1 inch to the back, and I proceeded to marking out my dart lines. I'm going to connect the bust point and the waistline together and proceed to cutting it out. Then this is the back panel. I'll be transferring all of this to my fabric. I transferred all my patterns to my fabric. This is for the front. I transferred the yoke. Transferred the bustier. And then for the yoke, I added half-inch allowance to the down that I'll be using to join into the rest of the half cut. And on the upper part of the half cut as well, I added half-inch allowance that I'll be using to join it to the yoke. And you remember that I've added sewing allowance already, so there's no need adding other sewing allowance. And for the back part pattern, I'm going to be eliminating the zip allowance on the yoke because the zip will not be extended to the yoke. If your zip will be extended to your yoke, you don't have to cut this out. Then I'm going to mark the keyhole at the back. So from the neckline, I measured 3 inches downward. Then I'm just going to draw the keyhole. This keyhole depends on whatever shape you are trying to achieve, and I proceeded to cutting it out. So my next tutorial will be step by step on how I was able to join all of these pieces together. Once I upload that tutorial, the link to it will be down in the description box, and the link to it will also be showing up on your screen. If you have any question, please ask me down in the comment section. If you've not subscribed, kindly subscribe. If this video has been helpful to you, do not forget to give it a thumbs up as much as possible. Help me share my video and miss your friends and soulmate, and I'll see you in my next tutorial. Bye.